In the summer of 1839, a Spanish schooner named La Amistad sailed quietly along the Caribbean Sea. On its deck, nothing seemed unusual. Sails filled with wind, officers commanded with ease, and the voyage pressed forward. But below, in the cramped and suffocating hold, dozens of Africans plotted a revolt that would soon shake the Atlantic world. These men and women had been kidnapped from their homeland, chained, and forced across the ocean on the Middle Passage. They were supposed to be voiceless cargo, destined for slavery in Cuba. But aboard the Amistad, they defied those chains. Led by Sengbe Pieh, remembered as Joseph Cinqué, the captives rose up, seizing weapons, storming the deck, and taking control of the ship in one of history's most dramatic rebellions at sea. Their victory at sea, however, was only the beginning. The Amistad was captured off the coast of Long Island, and suddenly the survivors were thrust into an American courtroom, facing a trial that would decide whether they were property or human beings with the right to freedom. The case drew worldwide attention, forcing the United States to confront a brutal question: could justice exist in a nation built on slavery? The Amistad Revolt was more than a mutiny. It was a revelation, a story of courage, betrayal, law, and morality that exposed the cruel truth of slavery to the world. By the year 1839, the transatlantic slave trade had been officially outlawed by most European powers, yet it still thrived in the shadows of empire. Treaties were signed, laws were written, and nations proclaimed their moral awakening. But the Atlantic continued to swallow ships heavy with human cargo. Traders adapted quickly, hiding their tracks with false documents, bribing port officials, and using smaller, faster ships to evade patrols. Spain, through its colony of Cuba, had become one of the most notorious violators of the ban. Havana was a city of wealth and misery, built on sugar fortunes that demanded an endless stream of enslaved Africans. The story of the Amistad cannot be told without first understanding this world, a world where law and morality were constantly bent to serve profit. Britain, having outlawed the slave trade in 1807, dispatched its navy to patrol the West African coast, but smugglers remained one step ahead. Portuguese and Spanish traders maintained secret outposts where they purchased captives from African middlemen, many of whom had been caught in wars or raids that were fueled by the demand for slaves. By the 1830s, Sierra Leone, the very region from which the Amistad captives came, was one of the most contested battlegrounds in this illegal trade. For enslaved Africans, the journey began long before the ocean crossing. Villages were raided, families were torn apart, and captives were forced on brutal marches to the coast. Once there, they were held in makeshift prisons known as barracoons, waiting for the next ship. Diseases swept through these enclosures, hunger gnawed at their bodies, and fear hollowed their eyes. The Middle Passage, the infamous voyage across the Atlantic, was a crucible of suffering. Chained in darkness, packed into holds where air was scarce and space almost non-existent, captives endured conditions so horrific that many did not survive. For every person who reached the Americas alive, countless others perished in the water or beneath the decks. And yet, for those who survived, the ordeal did not end on land. The plantations of Cuba, Brazil, and the American South demanded endless labor. Sugar was called white gold, and its price was measured not only in currency but in human lives. European elites drank sweetened tea in gilded salons, while thousands of Africans toiled in fields under a merciless sun. It was this hypocrisy, a world that celebrated civilization while trafficking in misery, that gave rise to acts of defiance like the Amistad Revolt. By the 1830s, Havana had become a global hub of human trafficking. Ships arrived under the cover of legality, their papers forged to disguise their cargo. The Spanish government publicly insisted that the trade had ended, but in reality, local officials were complicit, turning blind eyes in exchange for bribes. Captives from West Africa were unloaded and sold in markets as if they were barrels of rum or sacks of sugar. Families who had survived the Middle Passage were separated again, parceled out to plantations or loaded onto coastal schooners for transport to other regions of the Caribbean. One of those schooners was La Amistad. On the surface, it was a small, unremarkable vessel designed to carry cargo along the Cuban coast. But in 1839, it carried something far more dangerous to the colonial order. Africans who had endured the horrors of capture, the Middle Passage, and sale in Havana and who had nothing left to lose. Among them was Sengbe Pieh, later known in America as Joseph Cinqué, whose resolve would transform the ship into a symbol of defiance. To understand the significance of what happened aboard the Amistad, we must remember the contradictions of the time. The United States itself was torn between two visions: a republic built on the rhetoric of liberty and a society sustained by slavery. Northern abolitionists raised their voices in protest, but Southern planters clung tightly to their wealth and power. International treaties outlawed the slave trade, yet loopholes and corruption ensured its survival. The Amistad Revolt did not erupt in a vacuum. It was the spark that exposed a world where law, morality, and power collided in brutal ways. In 1839, the Atlantic world stood at a crossroads. Empires claimed progress but profited from bondage. Courts wrote laws but denied humanity. Ships sailed under false flags carrying not only sugar and tobacco, but the weight of lives stolen from Africa. Into this landscape sailed the Amistad, and aboard her were men and women who would refuse to let history erase their names. Their struggle was not simply against chains and captors, but against the very system that allowed slavery to persist under the guise of civilization. The revolt that erupted aboard the Amistad would shock the world because it shattered the silence. It forced judges, politicians, and citizens to confront a truth many tried to ignore: that enslaved Africans were not passive cargo, but human beings capable of fighting for their freedom. Before we reach that night of rebellion, however, we must step back into the villages of Sierra Leone, where the story truly begins. The story of the Amistad captives did not begin on the deck of a Cuban schooner. It began in the forests, rivers, and villages of West Africa, where men, women, and children lived lives full of meaning before violence tore them away. Many of those who would one day fight for freedom on the Amistad came from the region of Sierra Leone, a place of fertile lands, vibrant cultures, and proud traditions of resistance. To understand their revolt, we must first understand what they lost. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, Sierra Leone had become a contested frontier of empire. European forts dotted the coast, trading posts where captives were exchanged for guns, cloth, and rum. Local rulers, pressured by demand, were drawn into wars that fed the slave markets. Raids swept through villages with terrifying speed. Families were shattered in moments, fathers seized while hunting, mothers dragged from farms, children taken in the night. Those captured were marched for miles in chains, their wrists bound, their necks yoked together with wooden poles. Along the routes, hunger and exhaustion claimed lives even before the sea was visible. When they reached the coast, captives were confined in barracoons, crude stockades built by traders to hold human cargo until ships arrived. Here, fear and despair mingled with faint threads of hope. Some prayed to be ransomed, others plotted escape, and many simply endured, their eyes fixed on the horizon. The barracoons at Lomboko, a notorious slave trading post in Sierra Leone, became the last memory of Africa for countless men and women who would never see their homes again. Among those brought to Lomboko in 1839 was a man remembered in history as Sengbe Pieh, or Joseph Cinqué. Born in the Mende-speaking regions of Sierra Leone, he was not an ordinary captive. Accounts suggest he had once been a farmer, strong and resourceful, a man who had known responsibility before his capture. Like many others, he was torn from his family, shackled and forced into the waiting dungeons that stank of sweat, sickness, and fear. The Middle Passage began when captives were herded onto ships bound for the Americas. The vessel that carried the future Amistad rebels was the Ticora, a Portuguese slave ship operating illegally despite international treaties banning such voyages. On the Ticora, bodies were crammed together in suffocating rows. The air below deck grew so foul that breathing was agony. Chains cut into ankles and wrists, sores festered, and disease swept unchecked. Survivors recalled the screams of those who died in the night, their bodies dragged up and cast into the sea with chilling regularity. It is estimated that nearly 1 in 5 captives perished during the Middle Passage. For those aboard the Ticora, every wave and every creak of the hull brought uncertainty. Would they survive? Would they ever see land again? Each sunrise was both blessing and curse, another day alive but still in chains. And yet, amid this torment, Bonds were formed. Strangers, thrown together by chance and violence, became allies in suffering. They whispered in Mende, in Temne, in other tongues of Sierra Leone, sharing stories, prayers, and fragments of hope. These connections would one day fuel the unity needed for revolt. When the Tacora finally reached Cuba, the captives were not free. They were sold like commodities at the Havana slave market, their bodies inspected, their ages guessed, their teeth pried open like livestock. Records were forged to claim they had been born in Cuba, making them legal under Spanish law, which technically banned the importation of Africans, but allowed the trade to continue under falsified papers. Buyers haggled, weighing the strength of arms and backs against the price of sugar and tobacco. It was here, in the markets of Havana, that the future passengers of the Amistad were divided into groups. Some were purchased by planters to labor in the cane fields. Others were chosen by merchants for resale. A group of 49 captives, including Sengbe Pieh, were bought by Spanish traders José Ruiz and Pedro Montes. Their destination was Puerto Príncipe, a town further along the Cuban coast. To get there, they would be loaded onto a small coastal vessel, La Amistad. The journey from African villages to the Amistad was one of brutal transformation. Free men and women became captives, captives became cargo, and cargo was reshuffled into ledgers and contracts. But what the traders did not realize was that beneath the chains and silence lay unbroken wills. The Africans sold onto the Amistad were not simply bodies for labor. They were people who carried with them memories of freedom, traditions of resilience, and a growing determination that would soon erupt into open defiance. The world remembers the revolt aboard the Amistad as a sudden spark, but it was not sudden at all. It was the result of every injustice endured on the march to the coast, every lash of hunger in the barracoons, every scream in the suffocating dark of the Tacora, and every indignity suffered in the slave markets of Havana. The revolt was born not at sea, but in Africa, in the moment when freedom was stolen and the will to reclaim it was planted in the hearts of those who refused to break. The ship La Amistad was not meant for grandeur. It was a modest coastal schooner, a trading vessel meant to ferry goods along the Cuban shoreline. But in June of 1839, its cargo was not sugar or tobacco, it was human lives. 49 men, 3 children, and several women from the Mende people of Sierra Leone were forced aboard, their wrists chained, their spirits heavy but unbroken. They had already endured the Middle Passage across the Atlantic, smuggled illegally into Cuba despite international treaties that had outlawed the transatlantic trade. Now, they were being sent on a shorter but no less cruel journey, from Havana to sugar plantations along the Cuban coast, where their futures promised only endless toil and silence. Conditions on La Amistad were suffocating. The captives were crammed into the narrow hold with little space to move. Shackles bit into their wrists and ankles, leaving raw sores. Food was meager, water scarce, and the stench of sweat and sickness filled the air. At night, the sound of the sea was broken only by whispers, prayers, chants, and fragments of memory shared between those who still held on to hope. Though they spoke different tongues, they were bound together by more than chains. They shared the weight of injustice, the longing for freedom, and the knowledge that their lives were worth more than the profits of merchants. Above deck, the crew of Spaniards treated the captives as cargo to be delivered, little more than numbers in a ledger. But what they underestimated was the fire that still burned in the hearts of those below. Among them was a man named Sengbe Pieh, later known in America as Cinqué. Strong, determined, and unwilling to accept a life in chains, Sengbe became the quiet center of hope. He watched, he planned, and he waited. The days dragged, the Cuban sun beat down on the wooden deck, the waves tossed the ship, and the horizon seemed endless. To the captives, every sunrise was a reminder that they were being carried further away from home, deeper into slavery. But each sunrise was also another chance, another moment to seize freedom if courage outweighed fear. On La Amistad, despair was heavy, but so too was resolve. The schooner's deck, its ropes, its sails, and even its cargo of sugar and supplies would soon become the stage for one of the most daring acts of resistance in history. The crew believed the Africans were broken, beaten, and resigned. They were wrong. Beneath the weight of chains, rebellion was already stirring. The night was thick and heavy, the sea restless under a half-hidden moon. Below deck on La Amistad, the captives whispered in hushed tones, their voices almost drowned by the creaking of wood and the hiss of waves. In the darkness, Sengbe Pieh, Cinqué, moved quietly among his companions. His eyes glinted with determination, his hands testing the iron shackles that bound them. Tonight would not pass like the nights before. Tonight, they would fight. The plan was dangerous, but hope had long outweighed fear. A nail, smuggled and sharpened, had become their key. Slowly, painfully, they worked the locks, freeing wrists rubbed raw by iron. The sound of metal giving way was like thunder in their hearts. For the first time since their capture, their hands were their own. With chains discarded, they armed themselves with whatever they could find. Sugarcane knives, heavy tools, anything sharp enough to cut or strong enough to strike. Then, like a wave breaking against stone, they rose. Cinqué led the charge, bursting onto the deck with a cry that split the night. The sailors, startled from sleep, stumbled to arms, but it was too late. The Africans, struck with the ferocity of men who fought not for conquest, but for life itself. Steel clashed in the moonlight, voices roared, and the deck became a battlefield. 2 of the ship's officers fell quickly, cut down in the struggle. Others begged for mercy, but mercy was a luxury slavery had long denied. Blood stained the wooden planks, the ocean swallowing screams as men were cast into the waves. The captives who had been cargo only hours before now commanded the vessel. When the fighting subsided, the Africans stood, panting and triumphant, their bodies slick with sweat and salt, their faces lit with the fire of survival. For the first time since leaving Sierra Leone, they were no longer prisoners. They were free, or so they believed. But freedom at sea was uncertain. Though they had seized the ship, they did not know the waters. They ordered the remaining Spanish sailors to steer them east toward Africa, toward home. Yet the Spaniards, fearful but cunning, had other plans. By day, they sailed as commanded. By night, they turned the ship northward toward the coast of the United States. The revolt had given them hope, but fate had not finished its cruel game. Ahead lay the American shore, where freedom and captivity would clash again, not with blades, but in courtrooms. For weeks, La Amistad drifted along uncertain waters, its sails torn, its crew divided, and its course manipulated by deception. By day, the Africans forced the remaining Spanish sailors to steer east toward the rising sun. But each night, when darkness cloaked the sea, the Spaniards quietly shifted the helm northward. The ocean, vast and unyielding, became both ally and traitor. At last, the ship's path brought it near the coastline of Long Island, New York. The rebels, weary but still resolved, believed they had finally drawn close to land where they might find safety. But the sight of land brought not deliverance, but disaster. On August 26, 1839, American naval officers, alerted by rumors of a strange vessel adrift with unfamiliar passengers, intercepted La Amistad. The Africans, still clutching their makeshift weapons, tried to assert their claim. They were not pirates, they shouted, not mutineers, but free men who had wrested their liberty from unjust chains. Their voices, however, were drowned out by the crack of muskets and the thunder of authority. Outnumbered and outgunned, they were overwhelmed. Dragged ashore, they were paraded in chains once more, the very chains they had fought so hard to break. The Spanish survivors accused them of mutiny and murder. To American officials, the Africans were neither heroes nor free men. They were cargo, caught in the middle of an international scandal. Soon, the captives found themselves imprisoned in New Haven, Connecticut, awaiting trial. Behind stone walls and iron bars, they faced a new kind of battlefield, one not of swords and sails, but of laws, courts, and politics. The fate of Cinqué and his companions would now depend on men in robes and wigs, men who spoke of justice yet lived in a world built upon slavery. For the Africans of La Amistad, the fight was far from over. They had conquered the ship. Now they would have to conquer the law. The stone walls of New Haven's jail were cold, but inside them burned a fire of defiance. Cinqué and his fellow captives waited, uncertain of the language around them, but certain of one truth. They were not criminals. They were men and women, stolen from their homes, chained in the holds of ships and forced into labor against their will. Their trial, however, would not be about justice as they understood it. It would be about power, politics, and profit. The case of La Amistad quickly captured national attention. To Spain, the Africans were property, and their release would undermine an empire's claim to dominion. To the United States government, caught between enforcing treaties and placating Southern slaveholders, the case was a political powder keg. But to abolitionists, it was an opportunity, a chance to expose slavery's brutality and force the nation to confront the question of freedom. Missionaries, lawyers, and activists came forward to aid the captives. They raised funds for interpreters, ensuring Cinqué and the others could finally tell their story in court. When Cinqué stood before the judges, his words, translated from Menda, cut through the courtroom's formality like a blade. "Give us free." Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered. Newspapers across the country reported every twist in the case. Some painted the captives as dangerous rebels, others as symbols of a universal yearning for liberty. In the North, abolitionists hailed them as proof of human resilience. In the South, planters saw them as a dire threat, a reminder of what could happen if enslaved people everywhere decided to rise. The trial was not only about the fate of 53 Africans, it was about the soul of a nation. Would America side with law and empire, or with freedom and justice? The answer, for now, was undecided. The battle had shifted from sea to shore, and the stakes were higher than ever. The courtroom in New Haven had become a stage, but the drama of La Amistad spread far beyond its walls. For abolitionists, the trial was a gift, a chance to show the nation, in undeniable detail, the cruelty of the transatlantic trade and the humanity of those who resisted it. Churches, lecture halls, and town squares across the North buzzed with discussion. Abolitionist newspapers printed fiery editorials, calling Cinqué and his companions not slaves, but freedom fighters. Petitions circulated, demanding their release. Fundraising campaigns gathered coins and dollars from ordinary citizens to support the captives' legal defense. Even school children contributed pennies, their names published proudly in local bulletins. The Africans themselves became symbols of defiance and dignity. When visitors came to see them in jail, they sometimes performed their traditional songs or recounted their ordeal with the aid of translators. To many, these moments shattered the stereotypes that slavery depended upon. They were not faceless cargo, as the traders had claimed, but individuals with voices, memories, and a fierce desire to return home. The movement spread overseas as well. British abolitionists who had already outlawed the slave trade in their empire watched closely. Pamphlets about the Amistad case crossed the Atlantic, stirring outrage and solidarity. For them, the trial was proof that the fight was far from over, that slavery remained a global injustice demanding global resistance. But as the abolitionists gained momentum, so too did their enemies. Southern newspapers condemned the North's sympathy for the Africans as dangerous fanaticism. Politicians warned that if the courts freed the captives, it would encourage uprisings in the American South. To them, Cinqué's cry for freedom was a threat echoing across every plantation. The Amistad case was no longer a simple legal dispute. It was a battle of narratives, one that asked whether America would define itself as a nation of liberty or a nation bound by chains. And waiting in the wings was a voice that would soon amplify the case beyond measure. A former president, John Quincy Adams, preparing to enter the courtroom and challenge the very conscience of his country. By 1841, the Amistad case had reached the highest court in the United States, the Supreme Court. And stepping into the chamber to defend the Africans was a man whose very presence commanded attention, John Quincy Adams, the 6th President of the United States, now a gray-haired congressman known as Old Man Eloquent. Adams was no stranger to battles of principle. He had fought slavery with words long before it became fashionable in Washington. To him, the Amistad case was not just about a handful of Africans, it was about the soul of the Republic. If America claimed to be the land of liberty, how could it justify sending men back into bondage for daring to seize their freedom? Standing before the justices, Adams spoke for hours, weaving history, law, and moral conviction into his argument. He invoked the Declaration of Independence, reminding the court that all men are created equal was not a phrase to be reserved for some, but a truth written for all. He dissected the traders' claims, exposing the fraud at the heart of the so-called property rights. He painted Cinqué and his companions not as criminals, but as men resisting unlawful captivity, the same way America's own revolutionaries had once resisted tyranny. As Adams spoke, the Africans watched. Through interpreters, they understood fragments, but they sensed his passion. Cinqué himself reportedly stood, stretching out his arm, declaring in broken English, "Give us free." The words echoed through the chamber, piercing the formality of law with the raw demand of justice. Outside the court, crowds gathered, waiting for news. Abolitionists prayed, Southern planners seethed, and newspapers across the country speculated on what the verdict might mean for the fragile balance between North and South. When Adams concluded, he left the justices with a challenge: to decide not only the fate of the Africans, but the moral direction of the United States itself. The case now rested in the hands of the nation's highest judges. Their decision would reverberate across oceans, from the shores of Africa to the plantations of the American South. On March 9, 1841, the chamber of the United States Supreme Court filled with tense anticipation. Justices in their black robes sat in silence as Chief Justice Joseph Story, one of the most respected legal minds of the era, prepared to deliver the court's decision in the Amistad case. The ruling was clear: the Africans were free. Story declared that they had been kidnapped illegally from Africa, sold in violation of international treaties banning the transatlantic trade, and carried aboard the Amistad under false claims. Because they were never legally slaves, they could not be considered property. Their revolt against their captors was therefore an act of self-defense, not a crime. The words landed like thunder. For the first time, the highest court in America had ruled in favor of African captives resisting enslavement. Cinqué and his companions were not only absolved but recognized as free men with the right to return home. The decision sent shockwaves across the nation. Abolitionists celebrated. Church bells rang in northern towns, and newspapers hailed the decision as a triumph of liberty. Yet in the South, anger and fear spread. Planters muttered that the ruling threatened the very foundation of their society. If the courts could side with the Africans of the Amistad, what might happen if enslaved people in America rose in rebellion and claimed the same right to resist? For Cinqué and his companions, freedom was not just a word in a law book, it was a promise that would take them across the ocean. But before their return to Africa could be arranged, they spent months in the United States, speaking at abolitionist gatherings, becoming symbols of the global fight against slavery. In those months, the Amistad Africans transformed from captives into witnesses, living proof that resistance was possible, that law could sometimes bend toward justice, and that the voices of the enslaved could not be forever silenced. When the ruling was delivered and the Amistad Africans were declared free, another challenge remained: how to return them home. For abolitionists, freedom meant more than release from prison. It meant restoring the survivors to their homeland, far from the plantations that had sought to claim them. Supporters across the North raised money for the voyage. Churches, activists, and everyday citizens contributed funds, seeing in Cinqué and his companions a living testimony of justice. In November 1841, after more than 2 years in America, the Africans boarded a ship bound for Sierra Leone. The journey was bittersweet. They were finally leaving behind the courts, the prisons, and the endless questions about their fate. Yet not all who had begun the voyage on the Amistad were alive to see this return. Some had perished during the rebellion, others in prison, their voices now carried only in memory. Those who remained bore the weight of both grief and triumph. When they arrived on African soil, the survivors stepped onto land not as captives, but as free men. They had traveled from freedom into chains, across oceans, through rebellion, and into the heart of a foreign legal system, and returned once more to freedom. Cinqué, who had led them with defiance and determination, was welcomed as a hero. But their story did not end quietly. In America, the Amistad case became a rallying cry for abolitionists. It proved that resistance was possible, that courts could not ignore injustice forever, and that the struggle for liberty could not be confined by borders. For enslavers, however, it was a chilling warning, proof that the enslaved would not remain silent. The Amistad Rebellion thus closed where it began, on African shores. Yet, Its legacy stretched far beyond the survivors. It echoed in abolitionist speeches, in the fears of slaveholders, and in the enduring truth that freedom, once claimed, could never be forgotten.